Here, I have a brand new board featuring the Raspberry Pi Foundation's RP2040 silicon. This board is the tiny 2040 from Pimoroni. I bought it from their website for about £8, without shipping. The main selling point of this board is obviously its compact nature. In terms of size, this board certainly lives up to its name. Coming in at pretty much the same size as a UK postage stamp, it can fit into a whole load of projects. In actual measurements, this is a size of 22.9 by 18.2 by 6mm. I feel that the size of this board makes it so much easier to integrate into some size-constrained projects than the Pico. In fact, when comparing it to a Pico, we can see that the tiny 2040 has significantly fewer pins than the Pico, but is actually much more compact. This could be due to many of the ground pins which we find on the Pico have been omitted on the tiny 2040. Actually, the 8 ground pins of the Pico have been reduced to only 2 on the tiny 2040. In terms of power pins, the tiny 2040 has an input pin labelled VBus and a 3.3 volts output pin. It retains the castellated edges, but it might be quite tricky to use these when soldering them onto another PCB, as the RP2040 chip is actually mounted on the back and would elevate the board, but you could get around this with clever PCB design. It appears that much of the functionality of the RP2040 is retained despite the reduced pinout. There are 12 GPIO pins, with 4 of them supporting analog inputs. That's actually one more than the Pico. We also have 2 buttons, a reset button and a boot select button, which acts as it does on the Pico. The boot select button can also be used as a user input. Between these 2 buttons, we have an RGB LED addressed by pins 18, 19 and 20. We also retain the SWD or serial wire debug, programming and debugging pins, which is very useful for debugging your projects. In terms of specs, this board uses the RP2040 microcontroller from the Raspberry Pi Foundation, just like the Pico, so it has all the features you would expect from that chip, such as the dual-core ARM architecture, SPI, I2C and UART controllers for example. As previously mentioned, it has access to 4 analog inputs, and the board itself has a USB-C connection, which is so much nicer than the Pico's micro USB. It has 8MB of onboard flash, which should be plenty for most projects, and it also has an onboard 3.3 volts regulator, which can take an input of between 3 to 5.5 volts, so it's easy to power over USB or other means. This board can be programmed just like the Pico, either in C or in MicroPython or CircuitPython, and the only difference you have to be careful of is the different pin outputs from the Pico. All my Pico video tutorials are still valid for this board as long as you are careful with the pin assignments. I've written a short program to alternate the RGB LED between red, green and blue, and I will program the tiny 2040 just like the Pico. In a future video, I will show how to use PWM control to nicely fade the LED. Holding down the boot select and plugging in the USB-C cable, then dragging and dropping the UF2 file over programs the chip. Now, as you can see, the LED is blinking red, green and blue. So this is just a super quick introduction about the tiny 2040 board from Pimoroni. Let me know what projects you would like to see with this device. I think that I will create a nice small enclosure for this board and see if I can use it as a Pico probe. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe if you found this video interesting, and leave your suggestions in the comments.